When Des and Kirsten asked me to come and speak at this conference, I actually first said that I didn't think that I was the right person, because I really don't know a great deal about the points-based immigration system, although some of my colleagues at the Institute for Race Relations have written about it. But they persuaded me to come because they said that they wanted me to talk about the broader context of immigration control. Then I tried to actually ask to be excused from this meeting because I'm organising a conference next week around the rise of Islamophobia in Europe. The extreme right are now mobilising to collect 1 million signatures to force a debate in the European Parliament to ban the constructions of mosques and minarets, to make them forbidden around Europe. And again, they persuaded me to come. So 2 days ago, I decided I would actually start to think about what I was going to say today. And then something happened that stopped me thinking, stopped me being able to prepare. But I actually think that the context for our discussions today has to be the fact that 3 escorts employed by the UK Border Agency felt that they had a mandate to sit on top of a man who was in his 40s, a man from Africa, an Angolan man called Jimmy Mubenga. They felt they had a mandate to sit on top of him and to suffocate him. One thing that strikes me about this awful death is what was the point of deporting a man who has 5 children, 4 of whom were born in this country, and was the breadwinner for that family? How much money has been spent on this removal process to leave 5 children without a father? So for the last 2 days, I've been very busy trying to inform the press about the general context. There's a briefing paper on our website that actually we put out last week on the whole accelerated removals programme in Europe. And in that we point out that 14 now, 14 people have died in Europe since 1991 during the forced deportation. Most of those died of positional asphyxia or cardiac arrest. Of the 14, 10 were Africans, which for me suggests that our immigration officials feel that they have a mandate to use excessive force on black Africans, which I think reinforces Les's point about hierarchies and rankings of humanity. I want to just talk about 2 things today. I want to take you briefly through the stages of the managed migration process, and then secondly conclude with some general remarks about racism. I was a bit embarrassed when Les kept looking at me to say you're going to say some really interesting things about, you know, the new forms of racism, but I'm very much speaking from the top of my head today. In terms of this whole points-based system for students, I very much see it as the latest stage in a process that has been rolling on for the last 20 years. It's a process of managed migration. Within that, 2 things have been going on at the level of our political masters in blocs like the European Union or in the United States, Australia. The same things are going on. Everything in an era of globalisation, global financial markets, global movement of people means that the skills pool is essential if countries' blocks are going to be able to compete against other countries and blocks. So the skills pool is key. So our whole immigration policies have been realigned to ensure that we get the highly skilled workers from the world, even from the so-called newly development countries, the doctors, the computer experts, etc. We get those here. At the same time, we know there is a huge amount of hypocrisy in the debate because we also need to fill gaps in particular sectors of not so highly skilled workers, like construction, like agriculture. And also, of course, we need to attract the students that we want. So basically, immigration policies have been realigned on that principle, which I think both speakers have addressed. The second corollary from that is there's been a massive realignment of our citizenship policies because states are more anxious to control the route to citizenship. They want the migrant worker, the one who's very low down, the seasonal worker, they want his labour, her labour, all our care industries, domestic workers, women, they want those women, but they don't want them to stay and they don't want them to bring their families in. So they're like guest workers. They're not going to have access to citizenship. At the same time, the highly skilled can have access to citizenship. And this is having massive, massive implications across Europe. It affects the settled communities because there's been a harsh attitude towards family reunification. So now settled communities of migrant origin around Europe are finding it increasingly difficult to bring in elderly relatives, even though they've lived and worked in Europe for years. There is a whole system of pre-entry interrogation tests now, which means that if somebody, say a German Turk, wants to marry a woman from Turkey, integration starts in Turkey. She has to go through various integration tests. So that's also happened. And this is where the immigration control point system for students come in as well. It's part of this process. The other massive thing that has happened over the last 20 years has been the whole breakup of the Geneva Convention on Refugees. Just as with the war on terror, we've seen the breakup of the Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners, so prisoners are now enemy combatants. Now we've seen the breakup of the Geneva Convention on refugees, where refugees are now bogus asylum seekers and scroungers. And as a corollary to that, we've seen the budgets at an EU level, which were put aside for EU integration of refugees, increasingly being taken from refugee integration here to actually paying for a system of accelerated removals and for control of our borders through agencies like Frontex, who now control the maritime borders and stop asylum seekers getting here in the first place. So that's the system. What are the repercussions? And this is where I think we have to begin to look at this whole system and how it's creating new forms of racism and new hierarchies of humanity. Now, you may have seen an article in a magazine called Prospect recently, where a number of, sort of influential figures from the settled communities of this country, many of whom may have close links to the Conservative Party, said there's no such thing as race. Racism isn't a problem anymore in this country. We've got all this wonderful anti-discrimination legislation and the settled communities are well integrated. Well, I would suggest that there is still a lot of racism towards settled black communities in this country. You only have to look at the stop and search figures. You only have to look at who's dying in police custody. There's still a big issue of black deaths in police custody. But I would also like to suggest that there are new forms of racism. And that racism is still there based on skin colour. But there is also a complex system of racism that has developed because society is increasingly divided into citizens demi-citizens and non-citizens. And if you're in the demi-citizen and the non-citizen category, you are dehumanised and you are seen to actually not even have the basics of human rights. So a situation is developing, a very worrying situation is developing around access to the welfare state, access to social rights, civil rights, which is suggesting that if you have non-citizenship, demi-citizenship, or if you have a foreigner, you should not have access to even the basic assistance. And I think that denotes what a brutal, nasty, horrible society that we are turning into. There's going to be a mass problem in the years to come around young people. So I encourage you today to make the links between what you will face as students and what your friends and colleagues will face because of the immigration point system. And what young people, like the son of Jimmy Mubenga, the oldest son is 16. The whole family is subject to a deportation order. They want to remove the whole family. Why they have to separate the father and remove the father's self from the child, it's beyond me. But these children, increasingly, are going to be deported. A third of the children at my daughter's secondary school in East London do not have a British passport. We are fighting for their right to a higher education as well. Once they hit 18, they're not going to be allowed to go to university. If they have a criminal record, they're going to end up in a special prison for foreign national prisoners, and they're going to be deported to a country that they've never seen before. A final thing that I would say is that this whole debate around immigration controls and citizenship can't be divorced from the other aspect of the new racism, which is anti-Muslim racism, which is linked to Islamophobia. Because part of the justification for this harsh climate came after 9/11. After 9/11, all immigration controls have been subjected to a security mantra. So when we talk about what's happening in universities in terms of the UK point system, we also have to look at the systems of control and surveillance that are happening to Muslim students, whether citizens or non-citizens. And we've already seen quite a few cases, like what happened up in Manchester. We have Justice for the North West 10 campaign, what happened at Nottingham to Hisham Yeja and the other student who were arrested on anti-terrorist laws. So, to conclude, I would say we're entering a new phase of racism in the age of austerity, if you like. And I would very much like to reiterate the point that Les made. Hierarchies and the ranking of humanities. Rights for people who have citizenship status. Human rights abuses for those who are just passing through.